Some quick background on Justin then before I hand it over. He joined Policy Integrity in April of 2019. Before that, when I initially became aware of his work, he was a project manager at NYSERDA working on their various initiatives. And, you know, just for a little color, when we were on the phone yesterday preparing for this, he was sure to make it clear to me that in German, task force is actually a feminine noun, and therefore we shouldn't be der task force, we should be die task force, which that was pretty funny. That's the kind of guy he is. Don't light him up too hard in the chat. He's a lawyer, you'll pay for it. Just kidding. But Justin's awesome, he's brilliant. This is gonna be really cool. So I'll hand it over to Justin, and perhaps you could start us off with just a quick description of what policy integrity is. What do you guys do?
Sure. Well, just to clarify, it wasn't that it ought to be the task force. It's that you're going to get some awkwardness among German participants just because the word has been absorbed with the feminine article. So you're just going to get a double take. That's all I wanted to mention there. Right. Policy integrity. So Policy Integrity is a think tank at NYU School of Law. We've definitely got a foot in the academy, but also we try to keep a foot pretty firmly in the world, and we engage here and there in a number of different proceedings and forums, including before courts and agencies at the state and federal level. I guess the quickest way I can think to sum the place up is that if we had a religion, it would be cost-benefit analysis. We are firm believers in policy being rational and rationality best being implemented through a rigorous evaluation and comparison of benefits and costs. There are ways to determine whether or not such an analysis is better or worse. We figure if everyone can agree on those rules, we can at least arrive at a conclusion we can all agree on, even if we don't like where we end up. There's lots more to say about our work, but the last point I'll make for now is just that energy has become a real burgeoning area because what with climate change and all, it is very much the nexus of environmental impacts and what used to be sort of conventional economic analysis without consideration of externalities. And it's a nexus where cost-benefit analysis and consideration of how to integrate things that don't necessarily fit together, or at least haven't been fitted together in the past, requires a lot of work and is potentially very fruitful. So that's a place where several of us are focused these days.
And Justin, just one quick thing. I think you might be in presenter mode. If you go to view options, you can have it just show the screen share, just because we can see your notes.
Oh no, how embarrassing. Well, okay. In that case, here's what I'm going to ask you all to tolerate, which is I'm going to end up looking down a bit if that's how we're going to do this. I mean, there's nothing embarrassing in the notes, but you know that means you're going to end up listening to them as well as being able to see them.
Whichever you prefer. I thought I'd just let you know.
No, I do appreciate that. Sorry for the inconvenience. Is this?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so let's do it this way. And please have patience for me as I don't make eye contact, which wouldn't be happening anyway. So, all right. Right, so that's a quick intro of policy integrity. I'll start, I guess, by introducing the objective that we had in mind for the report, which is not in keeping with what I've said there about us having a foot in the academy, but also a foot in the world. Our goal here was really to make something useful for policymakers, but also for stakeholders and advocates who are engaged in, well, there's a long list of different things going on these days in relation to DERs, both formal proceedings before commissions and also informal stuff, whether policy level or more in the private sector. And so in keeping with that, even though we've got this filter system through Duncan, please do make comments and ask questions, because we're not going to change the report terribly much, but I'm eager to hear what reactions and inquiries you all might have. All right. So the structure of this presentation is going to follow the structure of the report pretty closely. If you have read the report, don't worry, it won't be totally redundant, but there won't be many surprises. I'm going to go into a bit of background, not terribly much, because I think most folks here are going to be familiar with the basic concepts. A lot of this is going to be me discussing, predictably, the ways that we went about proposing that you value DERs. And where we're going to end up is what I've called reasons to move beyond net metering, which, well, it'll be pretty obvious why we think that flows directly from DER valuation. Right, so I talked about how our objective was that this thing be useful, but our motivation really was a concern, which is that policymakers' reliance on net metering, or even a successor program, is potentially going to cause DERs to be installed in the wrong places and operated at the wrong times. So if your objectives are to deliver electricity services cost effectively and in a way that reduces emissions resulting from generation, DER deployment is not an unalloyed good. You can't count on deploying them and expecting that they're going to achieve that policy goal that you had in mind. Installed at the right place and operated at the right time, they of course can do a better job than the centralized grid, either in cost terms or emissions in other terms. But if one or both of those conditions do not hold, if it's in the wrong place, if it's not operated at the right time, then it's probably not going to outperform the centralized grid. And that could actually end up making the system less efficient, more cost effective, and even potentially more emissions intensive. So in the background for us is this question of where do DERs tend to get installed and when do they tend to be operated? And the answer probably is going to be when they get paid for and where they get paid for. So compensation is really going to shape the answers to those questions. There are people who are committed to installing solar panels just because they think that's better. But I would say the population of people who have installed DERs maybe used to look that way in the mid-90s. Increasingly, it's people who are eager to save as well as maybe wanting to help. And so the upshot for the purpose of this report and our approach to DER valuation more generally is that we really want to align compensation for DERs with these time and location sensitive factors. So a couple points of background. As I said, I'm going to try to be brief with these. Net metering. Basics, it involves a customer that has an on-site DER capable of generating electricity and a single electricity meter. You draw electricity from the grid, the meter runs forward. You generate more than you consume, excess generation flows to the grid and the meter runs backward. This used to literally be the case in the era of analog meters. And really, I mean, this again might be repetitious for some, but just in case it's not, I think it is worth emphasizing. Understanding that metering really does require a sort of historical perspective. This is not a solution that was designed. This was something adopted in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, because it was simple and effectively free to states and taxpayers, but allowed people to install DERs that were capable of generation. It required no upgrades to metering, few changes to how utilities handled billing, and maybe most important, no change to the legal status of DER owners. And also, as I said, there are no subsidies. To the extent that there were cross subsidies, they were small because initially DER owners were a pretty small percentage of the population. So that didn't become a worry until decades after you saw this thing take root. And in short, net metering was a way to do this that allowed for DER deployment without any real disruption. So it took hold and has stuck around, again, not so much because it was designed, but because we got to build stuff without designing anything and making that a source of disagreement. But the key point here, for the purpose of policy integrity, I guess, is that net metering relies on the retail rate structure to value net consumption. And because classic two-part retail rates are generally volumetric and flat, that is, they're averaged across a billing cycle and not reflective of how ratepayer consumption interacts with coincident peak demand, from our perspective, and with respect to that point I made about time and location specific value, you're going to get the wrong value much or all of the time if you rely on the rate, which is mirrored in net metering. So for that reason, we think you can improve on net metering. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's bad, just that it is generally inaccurate. And if what we want to do as DERs proliferate is value them accurately so that they proliferate in the right places, we want to improve their valuation. Okay, you cannot talk about how to value something that you're putting on the grid without dealing with the problem of perspective. So I'll return to this a little bit when I talk about some of the arguments that you get regarding fairness. Actually, you can see me, so we'll do scare quotes, fairness, with respect to net metering. But right now, there are three general points to make. One is that to determine whether compensation conforms to cost causation, this is the bedrock principle of good rate regulation, you really need to choose one or more perspectives. This first became obvious in the 80s when utilities and commissions started trying to value energy efficiency, because energy efficiency lets ratepayers spend less money. Maybe it's also good for society, but utilities, which are getting less money, don't think of it as a good thing. So you have this perspectival disagreement, and you need to figure out which perspective is the valid one when assigning a value to the thing that maybe you're going to be compensating or subsidizing. When you're talking about DERs, you have the same problem, but it's more complicated because, of course, they generate electricity and inject the excess. And so choosing and implementing any given perspective, making resource valuations from that perspective has an additional layer and set of interactions in play. So we're into the value of DERs portion here. This is a list of functions. This is not the list of functions. There are a bunch of reports out there. The national labs have actually done a pretty good job. And this is just meant to be a compilation, really. But it is a useful summary. And the point to take, well, a couple points to take from the slide. One is just that the DER category is really untidy. In fact, I'm sure if we had it to do over, we wouldn't have defined it or scoped it in the way that we did. You first saw the term distributed energy resource, again, I think late 70s, early 80s. And it was just anything that wasn't part of the grid, really, which meant everything along that top row. So solar PV, energy efficiency, demand response. These are very dissimilar from each other, and they perform a wide range of functions, yet they are all in the category. Some of them can serve as substitutes for centralized resources in a variety of ways, others in very few ways, or maybe even just one. And the diversity of functions complicates how you characterize the costs and benefits. So I'll highlight a few points here, and I'll also say this tends to be a place that is the listing and characterization of benefits and costs, where you get some contention. Again, this isn't meant to be sort of biblical in quality. People will have disagreement regarding what belongs on which list and how exactly to put it. But with that caveat there, I'll just emphasize a few things. The first is that we put potential in the header of this table and also table 5, which is costs, because DERs have, as I said, diverse functional capabilities. And some of those are conditional on physical and regulatory circumstances. So the same device in a different place or a different jurisdiction is going to really have different opportunities to avoid certain costs. And also, there are, of course, just physical differences where storage and the right kind of inverter are necessary for rooftop solar in most places to provide any kind of resilience benefit, because if it's just a solar panel with the wrong kind of inverter, the grid shuts down, so does the panel.
Hey, Justin, could I quickly ask on the resilience benefit side, you know, there's conversations often about, is resilience really like a public or ratepayer benefit? Is it a private benefit? Like, do you have any thoughts there?
I do have thoughts there. I wrote about that problem, that is figuring out how to characterize not just the costs and benefits of an investment that improves resilience, but even just the characterization of resilience. And most recently, where I've talked this through in a sort of live regulatory proceeding was in Connecticut, where they are working on a study to value DERs. It's the deadline until COVID came up was July. It might still be July. And the discussion of resilience there in a hearing I attended was organized with two versions of resilience in mind. One is the resilience of grid operation. So from a sort of engineering system style view of, I guess, a confined sense of resilience. And there you can use stuff like the value of lost load as your primary estimator of what it is that you're getting for whatever you've spent. But Of course, most of the reason people invest in resilience is not just how well the grid functions per se, but how well those functions serve particular communities and particular locations. And so if you can't tell, I am avoiding your question, but the point I want to make is just that I don't think you can have a complete analysis of resilience if you don't take both into account. And for that and a couple other reasons, what we propose in this paper is that resilience be on the list. So when you're stacking up the values of DERs, it should absolutely feature, but it's not like the other things. And so it's a better candidate for something like an adder rather than an integrated variable that shows up in the equation and gets updated on a regular basis.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk more about this stuff because I have strong feelings. So we'll see if those come out.
That's super helpful. Thanks. Great.
Yeah, and so actually, and to your point, I said a version of this, but just to show how it shows up here, we have resilience in the society, public health and safety row, but it really does span the distribution system and that row. So it's not tidy, and that doesn't quite make it in here. So this one is costs. A couple points to highlight from this. Oh, sorry. Well, this was meant to be something I said in the past slide, but it doesn't really matter. With respect to both benefits and costs, one thing to keep in mind that is important as a background feature of our situation here, a lot of the information about costs and benefits is controlled by utilities. And so I don't mean to say that in a nefarious sounding way, but it is a relevant thing. And so even if we consider utilities to be utterly benign actors, there's going to be a transaction cost involved in extracting data that will reveal the particulars of these different items. That transaction is going to need to be mediated in some way. It adds an issue when you're talking about figuring out how not only to make sense of these things, but then how to characterize and specify them. And of course, maybe this is the nefarious element. In addition to controlling a lot of that information, sometimes utilities can even influence the level of the costs. So interconnection fees is one example. This stuff is, a lot of these dials turn, and who can turn the dials matters quite a lot. All right, graphics. So this is meant to be illustrative. I think we have a couple other items in the report itself, but here I'm illustrating two types of costs that DERs can avoid. On the left, we've got real-time wholesale energy prices in the New York ISO. It's 11 zones, and the data is taken from 1 p.m. on the hottest day of the summer in 2019. So that's wholesale. On the right, there's a representative selection of distribution system costs anticipated by Orange and Rockland in a marginal cost of service study it filed in 2019, I think, maybe 2018, on 11 of its 50 feeders. So if I were in the room, I would ask if the map on the left was familiar to everyone. It's hard to take a survey. I'll just assume that it sort of is. Basically, the wholesale market manager of the New York ISO has broken down the state into 11 zones. It prices energy differently in each of them, not that differently. Energy tends to flow pretty readily across most of the zones because transmission is usually not that congested. There are two huge exceptions, however, to that rule, which is that it's really between regions G through K and the rest, which is often called just upstate. You have several different transmission constraints. Another side note, upstate is very clean. You've got nuclear and a lot of renewables and some hydro. Downstate, by contrast, is not clean. You have less land area and a lot of old plants, including peakers. And so those transmission constraints mean a lot to folks who are thinking about emissions, but also just in terms of prices, they are going to prevent you from taking that cheap, clean power that is generally readily available even on hot days upstate and getting it downstate. And instead, because of those constraints, you need to turn everything on in places like Long Island and New York City. And so you get disparate prices like the ones shown here, where you can see the NYSO-wide average is just under $52 a megawatt hour. Out in Genesee, which is the location, I think, of at least one nuclear power plant, it's 27.5. New York City, it's 78.5. And then Long Island, it's way up around 230. And as I said, transmission constraints are really at the heart of this. And you can,
if I can ask, Genesee, Zone B, like, why does that look like a gerrymandered district in a red state? Like, what's going on there?
Oof, I didn't prepare for this one. I actually don't know what the backstory is behind the formulation of these boundaries.
Okay.
I have absolutely no idea. To my knowledge, they don't conform to current utility service areas. And so maybe they conform to historic utility service areas. If I had to guess, it would be some kind of engineering feature that was in place circa 2000, and or some quantity evaluated on an engineering basis of something.
Something about the grid.
Might be population, actually, now that I think of it, because there are some cities in the Genesee region that maybe account for this. I don't know.
Okay.
Better answer.
Let's move on from that one.
I don't know. Right. Yeah, so that's, there are several different implications to take from this map with respect to DERs and where they might be valuable. Obviously, it's a bit stressful if you need to get paid on this one day a year to make up the difference of losses the rest of the year, but that's probably not going to be the case. Most often what you're going to see is a pattern that reflects this constraint. And so Long Island seems like a very good place to build DERs if your goal is to avoid energy costs, which are boosted by transmission constraints. That's going to be one element that we say ought to feature in your value stack for reasons like transmission constraints, but not limited to them. Figure 7 on the right, this is distribution level. So Orange and Rockland has 50 feeders. These 11 are what I picked out as giving you a sense of the kinds of costs that Orange and Rockland expects to incur over the next 10 years. You'll note that there are 5 categories of costs listed because there are basically 5 different things that Orange and Rockland spends money on when it maintains and or upgrades its system. And some of those don't appear because Orange and Rockland doesn't expect to have to spend money on them in the next 10 years. And so for the purpose of DER valuation, those are those are costs that DERs will not help you to avoid. And the point here, well, there are several implications, but the one I'm focused on is just that the value of DERs really is going to be contingent. It's going to depend not only on how well your panel works and how much insulation you get, but also how much utility cost you can avoid, and thus how much ratepayer savings you can deliver. And that's going to vary not only in the big zones that you see on the map on the left, but even neighborhood to neighborhood. Okay. So I know that the general rule is never to put this many words on a slide, sorry. But this is meant to be the sort of 5-step generic recipe that we have in mind for how you value DERs. The very short version, you identify the resources that DERs will affect, you determine how they'll be affected, you monetize the effects, and then you compare them to a baseline. All of that is very easy to say and very hard to do. You also, of course, need to determine how frequently your measurements are going to need updating, and you make sure that they're updated. One thing to note, this works for most of the benefits and costs listed above. We already highlighted this a little bit. Resilience is a bit different. There are a couple different methodologies out there for valuing resilience. And in fact, I'm blanking on it now, one of the national labs just put out a report proposing numeric valuations. And I've never seen this kind of conclusion before. They more or less said, man, it's complicated. And they said lots of useful things, but mostly their answer to the question of how do you value resilience quantitatively was, well, you definitely don't do it in a generic way. So stop looking for the holy grail of some kind of equation. You're going to need to do a focused analysis, a contingent analysis, and be sensitive to local circumstance. Let's see. Right, and so in my quick summary of the recipe, there is a necessity, which is an accurate baseline of what it means in terms of benefits and costs to rely on the centralized grid. You need that for comparison. There's a future in which maybe we are not using a baseline and a counterfactual as the basis for our valuation DERs. We can talk about that future. It's a very exciting place. For now and for the foreseeable, I don't know, 5, 10 plus years, it's hard to imagine the circumstances that would enable that coming to fruition. So our proposal relies on something like a baseline. And I'll mention, this is another National Lab paper. The authors are Natalie Mims-Frick, Alicia Schwartz, and Elise Taylor. Oh no, it's a tough one. Anyukire. Let's hope that was it. It lays out 3 different levels, that's the term they use, for how to value DER integration. The first 2, you install one DER or several DERs, and you don't see any kind of shift in the system as a whole. The third is a more holistic, dynamic analysis of grid planning that incorporates the potential for lots of DERs being integrated. It's a very useful report. They put it out in 2018, and they styled it a guide for states. So if there are any states on the line, go read that report. But they, in addition to being useful, it's also helpful framing, I guess, for what we've done. Our analysis really just deals with what they call level 1 and 2. So we're not talking about the holistic view of taking the grid, planning in a way that assumes DERs are available to place along with utility investments. What we're talking about with our approach to valuation is, again, a counterfactual based, what do you get if you put one here or several there or a few over here? So table 7 here is just, well, it's just pulled from the report to show what I was saying before about updating and the both sources of different metrics and the intervals at which you're going to want them updated. So this ranges, as you can see, from hours to half a year. The hourly interval for energy, emissions, those are tethered, so that's why they move together. Transmission, you do not see transmission built quickly, so you've got a lot of time in between the need for any update to that. Resilience, as we say here, varies by jurisdiction. That's less a dodge than a truth. And similarly, wholesale capacity, this is going to be largely a function of the jurisdiction you're operating in. So this is meant to be the exciting part of the presentation. This is where we transition from the dry sources of value, nuts and bolts, to implications and, as you see, reasons to move beyond net metering. This graphic is towards the end of the report. Obviously, it has no numbers, but it's meant to illustrate quantities of a sort. These different bars approximate how different avoided costs relate to different contexts and how those contexts, well, context in terms of location and timing. It assumes a New York or California ISO region. So in those regions, clean energy is usually first in the generation merit order. Dirtier sources tend to show up later. If this were in PJM, it's very different. Coal is going to operate earlier in the stack. So we would not see a similar play. It would not play out in quite the same way. Before talking about the particulars of the graphic, let me just sum up our argument for replacing net metering with value stacking. It goes like this. Net metering cannot capture temporal and locational factors, but these are critical. And so long as retail rates ignore categories of costs and benefits, net metering is going to ignore them too. So one thing to note, net metering would be much less bad in a state where you have time of use rates that also reflect the cost of operating across different locations, and maybe where state policy incorporates emissions values. We can envision that maybe California, maybe somewhere else. But until you have rate design that introduces those elements, net metering is going to mirror something much coarser and, from our perspective, just much more inaccurate with respect to DER valuation. As a consequence, you're going to see incentives to put DERs, again, in the wrong place and operated at the wrong time. So that is why we think, until we see that wonderful future of rational rate design, which there are lots of things that stand in the way of getting there, we think a value stack is a good intermediate step and one that you can make use of for long enough that it's worth the investment. Now, as for the graphic itself, let me highlight a few things. First, the way the net metering bars relate to the others. So net metering here is conceived of as reflecting a standard two-part retail rate. Delivery reflects the retail utilities system costs, and commodity portion reflects what retail utilities purchase at wholesale. So the light gray bar segment is going to be proportionate to the average of the distribution system costs in each city. So you're going to get all of these different circumstances: off-peak, on-peak, congested, uncongested. The corresponding gray bar is going to homogenize the variation in those distribution system costs. And so you have all of this variation, you're not going to capture it. This just makes somewhat more concrete the more general point I've been repeating again and again. The dark gray corresponds similarly to bulk power system costs. That's the red, orange, and yellow. And so that's passed through, but there again, those costs are going to vary quite a lot with time and place. Your net metering valuation is going to ignore all of them. The other things, though, that I want to flag here, in addition to how the two relate and why so much information is lost with net metering, is just some points about the bars themselves and their contents. The first is that in locations that are not congested, you're not going to have capacity costs. So you have no orange bar segment. So that's the way that congestion is reflected here. And the other point is that the dark green bar, that's local air pollution as distinct from greenhouse gases, varies with different times because dirtier sources come online at different times. But the reason it is bigger in a large city than in a smaller city is not because of any difference in the resources. It's because more people live there. And so the public health impact of a unit of emissions in that city is multiplied by the number of people who it affects. And that is obviously a very different element of analysis than the energy cost inputs or the capital cost inputs that are the conventional approach for like a PURPA avoided cost methodology. But from our view, they are salient, and you'd be silly to ignore them, given how much, especially in New York City, for instance, you can really see big swings seasonally and even day to day in terms of air quality and the number of people who are going to feel it. I mentioned earlier when I first alluded to the relevance of perspective that it comes up often, or it doesn't come up, sorry, that's the problem. It doesn't come up, it should come up in relation to arguments about fairness. And fairness is usually the term that gets trundled out by the folks who these days are trying to reform net metering. Usually it's used in two ways, but the first and more often of the two is that it is unfair to low and moderate income ratepayers that some people can have solar panels, and the costs that those people avoid are shifted so that you have an unjust outcome whereby you have people who are avoiding paying their fair share because they're paying a lower rate, given that the rate is volumetric, they're consuming less power. But the system needs to make up for that somewhere, and so you see other people's rates take a hit. This cost shift is one way that you see arguments justified for tightening up restrictions on how much money flows to DER owners. The other one is about the fact that the utility still needs to provide capacity and access, even if you have your DER. And that's unfair in the sense that the utility needs to still recover its costs, but you're paying it less to do so. And that's often the justification for imposing or upping a demand charge. The reason I'm putting this together with the perspective point is that those arguments really do rely on taking a certain perspective and not taking the broader one. So if you view this from a societal perspective, then the question is about the value created for the system, and then cost causation with respect to that value. Basically, if you have gone to the trouble of investing in whatever the DER system is that you've got in your home, business, what have you, the value that you create for the system is something that we think ought to be measured by the same criteria broadly and against centralized alternatives. And when you talk about fairness, fine, let's make sure that we are all evaluated in comparable ways such that we get paid on comparable bases. Now, I realize I'm making this a little more argumentative than I had intended to. My goal here is not to make that something that dominates the rest of this conversation, but just to flag that these fairness arguments rely very heavily on a particular perspective. And once you integrate different analyses, they are not as compelling and maybe even fall apart. So that's all I've got in terms of presentation, but I look forward to questions. And yeah, here we go.
Cool. So we have a bunch of questions. I'll start with the one right at the bottom here, which is a question about, of these elements of the value stack, which from the DER builder and owner's perspective are, quote, bankable. And I guess that highly depends on how you define bankable, but I think what's being asked is sort of which are understood at the time the project is being designed, whereas which are kind of market revenues that vary at the whims of the market and maybe can't be fully understood at the time of construction.
Yeah. Well, given that I think I'm right in saying that the answer to that question is that all of them are going to be subject to policy decisions. So bankability is going to be a function of the relative certainty that you have in a given jurisdiction with respect to one or another element of the stack. You can be pretty confident that energy costs are going to be predictable into the future. They might change, but you have a rough idea of how they'll change. The question of how they'll be passed through and how they can then be reflected in compensation to the DER owner is very much subject to what the commission in your state can be persuaded of. And so I think what this gets to in part, and this isn't a complete answer, but what it gets to is this issue of whether you want to create certainty, even if that certainty is based on inaccurate valuation, very rough valuation, valuation that could be improved, but the improvement would involve a dynamism that we actually just want to avoid because we want everyone to be certain of what the rules are going to be for the next 20 years. But I am dodging the question, I acknowledge that, but my answer to it is that it is an issue that I know several different commissions are wrestling with, and they often think of it in terms of sort of cost of information analysis. So what is it going to take to render valid, usable, accurate information quickly, and how can we design a system that does that over 10 to 15 years, notwithstanding technological change and changes in business models.
Matt,
just I have a follow-up question to that actually.
Yeah.
So we're kind of seeing how this plays out in New York, right? And I have to admit that I'm a bit frustrated with how it's going in New York right now. So I invite your opinion on that too. But basically, I think I'm in agreement with like the sort of theoretical and structural approach of implementing this, but in practice, things end up looking a little different at times. So, for example, basically the way with PPAs and net metering, solar developers right now are used to, all the other ancillary benefits don't really matter in a way, because what's bankable is the sort of agreement with the off-taker. And Duncan knows this well with microgrid services agreements as well. And so it seems like in New York with VDER, they're trying to push developers to get more comfortable with sort of a more complex analysis with varying values, parts of the value stack, right? But in practice, what I've seen happen is they took this thing called the market transition credit as basically a something to sort of prop up the market and put a toe in the water before we dive in and have to start acting like maybe an IPP where power plants, they develop them at the wholesale level and there's no real certainty when you do that, right? Which I think we as an industry have to get to eventually. But so the market transition credit is essentially pushing everything in front of the meter in New York right now. Because if you develop a solar system or a battery behind the meter, you get 13 cents per kilowatt hour for whatever's being offset on the bill, and 28 cents for exporting, because the market transition credit basically adds up to 28 cents. So instead, if you just turn it into a community solar project, you get 28 cents, the market transition credit for everything, right? So essentially what they did is they laid out this broad framework, which is very much in line with everything you're talking about, but then to sort of cater to the developers in practice, they just stuck in this like additional piece of the value stack, which is very much like artificial in a way, right? Where projects are happening, but they're all in front of the meter, right? Because it's clear that the value is there. So I'm pretty frustrated right now in terms of the fact that like the promise of DERs, right, is that it's happening behind the meter. It's co-locating demand, flexible demand and supply being generated. But we've sort of rigged the system to actually to get projects done. We're pushing a lot of it in front of the meter. So like my question for you is, well, one, you may completely disagree with my analysis in New York. So I'd invite an argument there. But two, when we look at rolling this out in New Jersey, Connecticut, these sort of New York is the first to try something as ambitious and comprehensive as this. How do we avoid, or how do we, I can't call it a mistake really, but can we do better? Do you have a sort of suggestion when you're speaking with regulators about the sort of problem that I view as being created through this policy framework, or what are ways that we can sort of avoid just sticking things into the value stack to get projects done and avoiding that like maybe the real underlying value of the project and making sure each component is valued properly?
Yes, well, I don't disagree with your characterization. I think you have summarized well the scenario of a state where it had a couple different things going on at the same time. One was it wanted to create a structure for valuing DERs for the ages. It didn't want to have to do it again and again. And the theory was, let's take a long time up front, get it right, lock it down, and certainty and accuracy will prevail. In the meantime, not only did they have ambitious targets to hit, but those targets have been ramped up. And there was also there was a sort of journey of discovery regarding where we can, in fact, expect to locate DERs successfully in terms of locations in the state. And those locations happen to correspond to different utilities. And so you have this very layered problem with respect to the state's policy agenda. And the priority on the one hand that you're, I think, taking as primary correctly with respect to DERs, which is let's establish a system of evaluation that we don't need to doubt or anticipate maybe changing in the future. That was competing pretty heavily with the politically more salient goal of getting certain numbers built. And so my answer to your question is, I guess, in two parts. First is my hope is other states can learn from that. And also that New York can learn from that. I mean, in New York, in theory, what we've got now is this moment where the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act just entered into force on January 2nd. It is a massive pedestal on which you can build new policies. They can begin now unifying these different sort of theories and neighborhoods of policy decisions and organizing them in a way that avoids that kind of conflict. Other states, of course, can look at New York's experience and say, oh, wow, if you have competing policy priorities and one can be made to just trump the other, and you tweak a design in a way that actually undermines the objective of certainty, that can be a real problem and can undermine the point in the first place of inflicting all these stakeholder meetings on people. My impression is that that has basically been the theory informing at least Connecticut's approach, which is we want to do this once, we want it clean, we want it simple, we want to come out the other side without open questions and without an expectation that we're going to have to do it again next year. We'll see how that works. And my guess is that the way, whatever else happens, you're going to see, I think, a more integrated structure with respect to the valuation, both of DERs and utility scale, but also of community scale in the middle. And that at least is going to be the ambition. We'll see how that goes.
So that's great. My 10 cents here, and hopefully, you know, when you're on the front lines having these conversations, or I guess this may be a you know, not the best solution, but I was thinking, like, if we're doing a market transition credit, why don't we just turn that into a robust incentive program, right? If you need to push projects over the line because we're still waiting for the cost of batteries to come down the cost curve, why don't you just hand developers cash for a project instead of distorting the market mechanism, right? And so, like, have you seen that? You know, it seems to me like if we want to put fuel on the fire, you know, the incentive problems or the incentive you know, buckets are the issue here, and implementing them at the state level instead of just federally through the ITC. So are you seeing any, like, push, I guess, in that direction where, you know, if we just, NYSERDA puts out a huge pool of money for battery projects to happen, I imagine that'd be the fastest way to, you know, meet sustainability goals.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, your question is clearly going for a sort of, can't we simplify? And my answer is going to be, well, gosh, here are these other complicating factors, but here they are. I know that the situation in New York, and particularly with respect to storage, is one that is complicated very significantly by federal level issues. So trying to figure out what FERC is going to say about the valuation of storage, who gets to decide about the value of storage, and also whether or not you're going to need to see buyer-side mitigation of storage downstate. All of those are the latest headache for NYSERDA. The previous headache of NYSERDA was whether FDNY was going to let you put storage in buildings.
Mm-hmm.
These totally different institutions are making it really hard for them to just throw money at good technologies. That's my understanding, is that's what they want to do. And it's really a matter of getting the sort of sluice settled so that they can flow the water down the sluice. And because those other pieces are out of their control, their power is limited, and they need to do this sort of by hook or by crook thing in the meantime. Again, I'm mostly dodging your question. That's, I guess, the theme for today. I will not actually answer anyone's questions. But those are features that I think complicate the kind of solution that you have in mind, which I think a lot of policymakers wouldn't disagree makes sense abstracted from this really knotty set of problems that they need to navigate.
So just a quick tactical thing here. The meetup originally had a 4 o'clock end time. Justin, would you be open to sticking around for 10 or so more extra minutes? Awesome. All right, so let's jump into a few more of these, maybe some that we think we can get done in time. One I thought was pretty interesting from Russell, and I'm going to tweak it just a little bit to maybe just be more general. But you know, when we look at these value stacks, whether it might be for a front of the meter project where it's all quote export, or in a behind the meter project, it's just for the export. To do this right, should a state really ask its utilities to also engage in rate design and rate reform? Because we still kind of do end up with some of the essential issues from net metering, I think one of which James just highlighted, which is, you know, when you buy power differently than you sell power, it does kind of like mess with the dynamics of the whole thing. If you were to do this fresh in a state that had all the sort of political support you needed to get it done, would you do both at the same time?
Both meaning, sorry.
Rate design, rate reform, and value stack for.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't stop there. I would also price emissions. So like if you're giving me if I get to be king for a day, then yeah, what you do is you figure out the level at which you can most efficiently and simply address each of these, and you fix it there so that that solution is going to pass through all the others, and you don't need to come up with this weird exception. So, and this is part of what I mean when I talk about New York's new climate law. In the future, we're going to have an integrated policy structure. Right now, we have these pockets of the energy sector that we get to play with. And so playing with them in that way makes them susceptible and inconsistent, and makes the promise of integrated rate design and DER valuation decisions both available maybe in the future and desirable relative to what we're doing. So yeah, I mean, an unequivocal yes to doing them both at once. Because we can't necessarily do them both at once, you know, I think the follow-on point is, okay, so given that we don't live in that world, which one maybe should get priority? If we're going to have to live with net metering in a state, do we then not focus as much on net metering and go after rate design instead? I would say, yeah, it's going to depend on the state, but in several instances, absolutely. If you see an opportunity to solve part of the problem by solving another one at the same time, I can see that being, in fact, an elegant approach to that issue.
Cool.
Was that actually an answer?
Russell, it was your question. You tell us. Was that a good answer?
I don't need good. Just answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think zooming in on somewhere like New York City or New York State and saying, you know, is this the right approach for every state is the question. You know, it was probably too much too fast, and I think someone needed to do it, but it doesn't mean, you know, some states can maybe start with rate design and then eventually get into this as a transition. You know, that's just, I think every market needs to be kind of looked at independently, but yeah.
Yeah, and you know, what you make me think of actually is that in some states where the politics are going to make rate design reform a lot easier,
yeah, go
there first. I'm going to be talking to a bunch of folks in Arkansas about valuing DERs. I will be emphasizing a bit less the importance of valuing emissions.
There's a good sort of follow-up question from Savannah here, which is like the difference between importing and exporting. So, which is really weird, right? The like New York ISO not talking to, you know, whatever the VDER regime is in a way. If you're, yeah, it's sort of very related to what I said about community solar and behind the meter, in front of the meter, behind the meter. You know, I envision eventually like a retail provider, if you're exporting and buying through the same entity in a way, like there has to be some third party managing like that risk of real-time prices. And like import and export should converge in a way, right? Do you think that like this framework pushes us in that direction, I guess? Because it is strange, right? Like exporting power is a different cost than importing it. And we talk about a bidirectional grid and all this, so.
Yeah. the way I would answer that is I think this design doesn't aim at that problem. It's not incompatible with solutions to that problem. So I don't, put it this way, I don't think adopting a value stack creates a risk of some kind of path dependency, whereby you don't get to solutions to imports and exports being valued differently and arbitrage somehow still being advantageous, even though that doesn't make any sense. I do think that of all the places to watch for solutions to that problem is very much storage. And you're going to see a bunch of real-time experiments carried out in states where they're trying to deploy now. And given that I think oral argument on FERC's order on storage, which is 841, seemed to suggest that the court's going to say these challenges are not going to upend the order. Please continue, FERC. Go about your business. I think that signal will basically suggest to states that they can rely on the draft order, and we can all move ahead doing our experimental thing.
So we had another one from Jed. And Jed, I'm hoping you could just go off mute and say it, because I don't want to screw it up. You're on mute. You're on mute, Jed. Your first question, it was kind of like a high level thing just about sort of distribution, power outages, and.
Oh yeah. So, as it goes for reliability, the way we price reliability on the bulk power grid is that we have a declining cost curve, where if we have more reliability than we need, we still pay that reliability. We just pay a lesser price. But on the utility distribution side, there's a target reliability, and then they build assets up to that level. Since most outages are local, not bulk, if a DER provides additional reliability at the distribution level that isn't part of the utility's plan, shouldn't that be priced into the system?
I'll give the mealy-mouthed answer of, in principle, yes. Of course it should. I think, though, this does get very much to not the shallow version of the issue of perspective, but maybe the deeper version, which is for a long time, and in some jurisdictions very much right now, DERs and utilities do not play nicely together. And I think what your question goes to is a future in which, you can almost imagine the commission as parents saying to the kids, we're all going to play nice. You talk to him, you talk to her, everyone agree, these are the principles, and we're going to figure this out together. You've seen that play out in the context of providing detailed information about hosting capacity, about potential value of voided distribution costs, where utilities were either slow walking publication of it or the websites they put up were glitchy. But the commission basically came in and said, no, you need to pony up. You need to make it easier for these people who you don't like, who maybe are sort of your competitor, to do this better. I think what you're asking about is basically the next level of that kind of dispute, which is if we can all agree that the outcome that we're aiming at is either, whether you call it resilience or reliability, or, I think the general consensus seems to be forming that those two are different things, but they have a point of overlap. If those are the targets for us all, then yeah, we need to have, whether we have a sloping demand curve in the way that you do at wholesale for distribution level reliability evaluation, or we have a less formal mechanism that just recognizes the contribution of these little increments of DERs, absolutely incorporate that. I think, though, that the analysis of it is tough. So at what level are you going to be evaluating the contribution of a neighborhood scale of one house? Like, what you need to have a lot of different parameters agreed upon before you begin paying people on that basis. And And maybe, well, I feel like I'm kind of babbling in response at this point, but the key thing that I would say in answer, I think I've already said, which is that you have highlighted a place that I think everyone needs to go, which is either utilities take over the task of valuing and building DERs, and they do it at the threat of the commission, you know, somehow withholding profits if they don't, or you need commissions to say, developers know how to do this best. You're never going to be that good at it, utilities. Yes, you can do your non-wires alternatives, but we're talking about something else. Go help them build this thing even though you don't like it. And maybe, I mean, in fact, as I'm talking, I'm thinking, what you just said seems like a really good subject for a docket. You know, how do we all come together and stipulate certain features of reliability / resilience valuations such that we agree who gets paid and for what? But the reason I put it in that way is it's not something that can be articulated simply, and it's necessarily going to be integrated into whatever structures exist for either the rules that utilities have to follow or what it is that DERs are currently paid in that jurisdiction.
Everybody's nodding their heads.
That's great. That's great.
Cool. Well, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Savannah asked the very first question in the chat, and it's a doozy. Savannah, I was hoping you could ask it because I don't know what half of it means.
Yeah, maybe it can just be like a call out for future presenters. So we've come across the MCOS studies that I think, you know, you mentioned are used for T&D, like deferral evaluation across utilities in New York. They seem to be pretty inconsistent from year to year for the same utilities, and even from utility to utility. And I think at some point, like the PSC was like, no, Con Ed, like you have to redo this. You know, like there's clearly, it's not very clear like what actually goes on, but it seems like that doesn't impact quite a bit some of the actual value stack values that get used in the different market programs. And so I'd be curious if anyone has like dug deep into those MCOS studies to really understand what they're looking at and to understand how they do get used. Like kind of, I want to understand better the like bottom up, you know, fundamentals of how these different services get valued. Because I know the MCOS study is a big one, and it's like kind of all over the place. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but just like some thoughts.
Well, I have a response, if not an answer to your maybe question, which is that absolutely it has been noticed that the approach taken by different New York utilities to MCOS studies are not the same, either across utility or across year. That has been something that a lot of people recognize, including the DPS and the Commission, as a problem. And there's a lot of pressure now to figure out a set of parameters that everyone will employ. I mean, as you may have detected, I'm not terribly sympathetic to the plight of different utilities, but my understanding is that some of the utilities have even struggled to adopt very simple administrative solutions, just because, you know, there's Con Ed, which is a big, expensive monster that knows how to do lots of things. But then there are other utilities across the state that just do not have the same kind of back office capability. And so you have a capacity issue if you're going to tell everyone to adopt a given methodology. Can they actually do it well? And will the data they generate reflect high quality analysis? So that's one constraint on what the Commission can simply direct everyone to do. But I think, and this gets closer to an answer, one reason they, I think, have been so different from each other is because up to now they weren't that important. And now that we're deciding who gets paid based on this thing that previously was kind of just something to be rubber stamped, there's greater scrutiny and greater reliance on their content. And so there are certain big questions that you're seeing hashed out in New York, but also other jurisdictions as well, where utilities need to begin confessing how they arrive at their cost estimates, and they need to be scrutinized, because maybe they don't have a great record of those estimates meeting reality.
Awesome. Thanks.
I feel like that's one for people to connect offline on, because there's a lot to go on, not to unpack there. Okay, I think it's 4:10. I do think, unfortunately, we should probably wrap it up, just so we're not keeping people longer than we said we would. Something Justin and I talked about, though, yesterday was taking the unanswered questions and comments out of the chat and putting something together. What that something is, I don't know quite yet, and distributing it to everybody. So at least nobody's points are left out. So we'll work on doing that. So we'll keep the meeting open just for a little bit. So if you had any final thoughts or questions or comments, throw them in the chat now. This is your last shot. And otherwise, yeah, I mean, this has been super fun. In general, I think we'd like to hear what people's thoughts were on how a virtual meetup goes. This was our first experiment with it, and I think it went all right, but if you have suggestions on like ways to improve it, please let us know. James or Colleen, or do you have anything else? Sorry, what was that?
I just wanted to say, if I was the problem, please don't take that out on Duncan. Please, separate the platform and me.
I doubt that's the case. All right, James, Colleen, Russell, or anybody else, any final words?
I mean, I wanted to steal Justin for the podcast. As you guys will notice, if you listen, ends with one of Duncan's crazy ideas usually. I had a crazy idea I want to run by Duncan, but I mean Justin. But I think we'll just have to save it for another time. I don't have anything else. I'd love to. I just keep going on until like 6 p.m. tonight, so I'll cut myself off.
Send it to us, and we'll put it in the little update we released to everybody.
Perfect.
All right, cool. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. Stay tuned for future events, and if you have a suggestion for someone who could help lead a virtual meetup, please let us know. All right, thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.